There was always something unnatural about Spongebob Squarepants. And for a while, I couldn't figure it out. I obsessed for weeks on end over what about him made me feel so disturbed. He warps all fabric of logic, science, undoes physics and biology. So I started with such. I spent weeks studying the marine science and biology of this sponge, but even then, this creature baffled me, did things I couldn't physically explain. And I was right, because the terrifying secrets of the sponge go far beyond biology or physics. No, this entity is something that transcends our plane, and the shadow we see in his 25 years on the Nickelodeon was a mere imitation for our mortal eyes. Let me explain. I'm gonna ask you a pretty simple question. What is SpongeBob? I know, he's a sponge, it's in the name, but like, what really is he? Because a sponge is nothing like SpongeBob. A sponge doesn't have a brain, or organs, or anything that can produce the insanity of SpongeBob. He alone cries too much to be a sea sponge, a creature without a brain, or tear ducts. Now with this said, what is he then? Because he definitely seems like a sea sponge, and does have some traits that you could say are extreme cartoon versions of a sea sponge. So how about we run through SpongeBob's insane feats and see if any of them can be explained away by the terrifying biology of a sea sponge. Let's shove a real sea sponge into a violent, murderous meat grinder that separates him down to each individual cell. Would he survive? Well, kinda. Because while yes, we did just separate them down to each individual cell, those cells will eventually reconnect, and after a while, our sponge will be good as new. Now you're probably asking, why is this? Well, it's because a sponge in its cells has this nifty ability where they can become any other cell, so when they're broken down, they can just repair themselves without mattering which cell is which, piecing together the complex organism of a sponge. And well, this does explain how SpongeBob does all of this. But does this explain how SpongeBob can stretch his body, seemingly absorb anything, and expand in a cartoonishly stupid way? Well, kinda. See, a sea sponge is also 70-90% porous by volume, which means their entire body is a filter system with no real solid core. That means they can stretch themselves, expand, and basically be as flexible as putty since there's no solid core to damage. Plus, with no brain, organs, nervous system, there's just nothing important to damage. So, in a way, this explains SpongeBob's insane antics if you stretch your imagination a little for some cartoon logic. But it still doesn't mean he's a sponge. God, no. Nothing about this sponge is a sponge, especially his durability. This yellow square has survived so many things, from being launched to space to being hit with a boat and coming back every time unharmed. Pointing out the obvious, these are all things a sea sponge couldn't do. So what could? Well, the blast survivability is a good starting point. See, overpressure, which is basically just the pressure wave from an explosion, is very deadly, as anything above 14.5 psi is going to be fatal to soft tissue organisms. Why? Well, ruptured organs, lungs, and mainly destroyed cells are all outcomes of this, and no earthly healing mechanism can respond quick enough. Now, this is different underwater. Yeah, so basically underwater explosions behave differently than on the surface, and a sea sponge, something entirely underwater, with porous tissue, no air cavities, does theoretically distribute overpressure better than most organisms. So the question is, can SpongeBob survive all of this? God, no, what are you talking about? They're bombs. Yeah, no, better doesn't mean immune. He still did not, in any world of science and logic, survive these bombs, and his body would be blown to bits. This is all, of course, ignoring heat or radiation, because you know he's not surviving any of it. And sure, there are things SpongeBob could probably survive. He could go on land for a long time without dying, which is how he goes on land for a long time, he can also survive extreme temperature variation and a few other things, but none of the truly reality warping feats we see in the show. And this is ignoring his big ones. No, sponge biology simply can't explain any of this, so I went bigger. Maybe something is lying inside the story of the show, or a little outside of it, that explains this horrifying science, and it has nothing to do with biology, for it all started with a bomb. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States military detonated 23 nuclear weapons at a place called Bikini Atoll, but under that water is a place of radiation and horror, better known as Bikini Bottom. And well, you know this, everybody knows this, it's the most famous fact about SpongeBob ever. But why? Why did the show choose to be here? And how does it affect the science of SpongeBob Squarepants? And how does it affect the science of SpongeBob Squarepants? Well, the creator of the show was a marine biologist, so they knew a thing or two about the ocean, so you could say it was intentional. But what even happened in the first place? Well, there were a few tests done in a Bikini Atoll, starting with Operation Crossroad, where 2 detonations, 1 airburst, and 1 underwater. The underwater detonation, shot Baker, was actually designed to test the effect of nuclear weapons on naval vessels, and well, with that, it contaminated the entire lagoon with radioactive water. Now, the next test is Castle Bravo, the largest US military test ever. With 15 megatons being used, it was 1,000 times larger than Hiroshima, and SpongeBob Squarepants was right in the center of it. Wonderful. So what exactly happens because SpongeBob was there? Well, radioactive isotopes don't just sit in water. No, marine organisms absorb them as they become one with the food chain, and any plant or fish will absorb it as well, or a literal sponge that is filter feeding in the water for decades. And with that, I propose a theory. SpongeBob Squarepants has developed radiation poisoning from this insane nuclear testing right at his home. Instead of killing him, his biology has been warped past our standards of measure. While yes, this is inching on science fiction for how radiation does that, but I would say this is a problem we can worry about later, and instead, I want to go over his harder to solve feats and see if anything could make them possible. Now, the main feat here is him surviving incredibly powerful explosions, which I mentioned earlier, but now we'll go into way more detail with the pie. In the famous Dying for Pie episode, SpongeBob, through his usual antics, causes a nuclear explosion that he somehow survives, and the footage they use is actually of Operation Crossroad Baker, which means we have all the math for what this explosion would be. So the only question is, what does SpongeBob need to survive? Well, this explosion has the yield of 23 kilotons of TNT, and the energy release was 96 trillion joules. Yeah. Now, unlike Hiroshima, a sentence I can't believe I'm saying, Baker exploded 90 feet underwater, and while the pie did as well, this actually makes it more destructive because the water makes it so barely anything compresses. Now, in the real world, a lot happened from this. It vaporized the landing craft directly above, created a huge supersonic shockwave, and lifted almost 2 million tons of water. But all of this isn't that important, really. No, because SpongeBob is really in the center of this explosion. He's gonna need to survive 5 things. Let me explain. So, after immediate detonation, the nuclear fireball that SpongeBob will sit inside is gonna be 18 to 36 million Fahrenheit, which is hotter than the 15 million core of the sun. But because we're not on land, the water won't just get hot, it'll turn to plasma. So, SpongeBob needs to survive every molecule of the water around him turning into hydrogen and oxygen ions, where any normal material, organic or inorganic, would instantly vaporize. You know, I'm starting to think our nuclear radiation theory isn't holding up. But that isn't all. We have our next killer being pressure, and water transmits pressure about 4 times better than air. This is bad. Estimating the Baker explosion, the pressure in comparison is almost double what diamonds take to form. So SpongeBob needs to resist the compressive forces of 1 million atmospheres. Great. Acceleration. This is the expanding bubble that pushes water outwards at 1,700 miles per second within milliseconds. This leads to a lot of complex math about velocity and there's gravity and stuff you don't care for, so I'll save you and me some time. SpongeBob is gonna need to be tolerating roughly 80,000 gravitational force, which is 8,000 times what knocks a human out. And he again takes no damage whatsoever because he's SpongeBob Squarepants. I'm starting to get very worried for my theory, but I'm sure we're good, right? Right? How many more of these do we got? Number 4, radiation. At 23 kilotons, plutonium weapons produce an enormous amount of gamma rays, neutrons, and just a bunch of radioactive stuff. So right at the bomb, the radiation doses are gonna be around hundreds of thousands to millions of grays, which to a human would be fatal at 5. Oh my god. But to be fair, our theory is he is radioactive and can survive intense horrible conditions like 2,000 times the lethal human dose, and there are creatures like the tardigrade that can survive similar conditions, so just maybe it's possible. I'm sure our last thing won't break anything, being mechanical energy that SpongeBob's body would need to absorb. See, we can roughly say the mass of SpongeBob is like 8 to 10 pounds, so doing some math, we can also figure out that he would need to survive and absorb in just the initial launch about 1.4 megajoules. This is like getting hit with a car at 1,700 miles per hour, which I do think SpongeBob can somehow do, but I digress. So, yeah, maybe he isn't just radioactive, especially since to get it, he would need to survive all of this. Plus, if you include another feat, which I won't bore you with the math, he has also survived being the center of an explosion that could wipe out the entire Earth. Yeah, no, he's not a sponge, he's just not. Especially since we have our looming feat of tearing apart the entire universe. More on that later. So what is going on though? What is SpongeBob? Because I will not just sit here and take this non-scientific answer that barely even makes sense as truth. Thankfully, there is a way better one, and I think it all lies with the string and what SpongeBob is really doing. Let me explain. Before I keep going, I urge you to subscribe, but only if you like this video so far. I have this insane goal of 50,000 subs before the end of the year, but I think it's possible if we really try. Either way, back to the video. In SpongeBob Squarepants, this yellow blob somehow pulls apart the entire universe by pulling on a string on Squidward's shirt. This is not possible and no way makes sense. So how do I, in any universe of science, explain it? Well, I have a solution. Stay with me. Technically, SpongeBob just doesn't have the ability to unravel the universe. No, the string does. He just pulled it, and I don't have to do any math for this string. Perfect solution. You guys happy? No? Why not? You want me to seriously do all the math and science for the string and SpongeBob? Why not? What's 2 more weeks of my life? In geometry, there is a concept. This concept also carries on through philosophy, religion, the supernatural, and even physics. It is the idea of dimensions, being our own, the third, the ones below, and the idea of a fourth. And while it's very difficult to explain the fourth dimension, as it's like trying to describe colors to someone born blind, we just don't have language for it or the directions in it. No basic frame of reference, but it's very detrimental to our understanding of SpongeBob Squarepants. Stay with me. What is a dimension? Well, simply put, it's a direction, that's all. Now in more detail, it is a direction you can move on. So say you're in the first dimension, you would be standing on a line, and you can move forward and backwards in that one direction. But let's say you're Doodlebob and exists on the 2D plane. Well, you can move forward and backwards, but also right and left. Now expand the world around you, like when Doodlebob came to the third dimension, well now you have up and down. Now how do we determine a new plane? Well, if you've noticed, we only add a new one when we have a new independent direction, not a combination or new way of saying an old one. And if you try to imagine a new direction, you just can't, because we don't need to. Our brains are not wired to perceive a fourth because we can't move through it. But what would a 3D object on a 2D plane look like? Would you just not see it? Well, no, you very much would. It just looked very weird. Say a sphere lands in a doodle-off dimension. Well, to him, it looked like a circle that can grow and appear, then vanish. All angles will be flattened in the view he has of the world. But the most interesting part is the only thing you perceive on the 2D plane is the shadow of the 3D object, meaning all the madness and strangeness is just a shadow. Now, a 4D creature would truly break your understanding of physics and cause and effect because they exist outside of it. Just like you could reach your finger in the inside of a circle on a 2D plane, they could reach theirs into a locked room or the inside of your body. Some would say a 4D creature is a ghost or a deity or something supernatural, and while yes, it could be, my best example of the insanity of a 4D creature is a yellow sponge. But before we go deeper into that, let me get you a better understanding of the 4D plane and how something from it is so much more insane than you think, mainly in how it governs time itself. There are two ways to look at the 4D plane, being geometry and time. The best way to view it though is to combine these two in a multi-angled way. Get it? Okay, so we already mentioned how a 4D creature, like Spongebob, could basically interact with the world from an outside layer, like we do with a drawing on paper. A sealed box is not sealed from an angle we can't see or cover. It's exactly how he can move through the little show's bubble transitions, or just straight up teleport. But another way to look at a 4D object is see all angles at once. Imagine a banana on your phone, a 2D plane, but it's capturing a 3D object that you can recognize as a 3D object. You would say on this 2D plane at one angle, you're still seeing this whole object. But now, imagine the 3D object in your hand. You can view it from any angle you want. This is definitely a full banana, and you can see it in all angles, right? Well, no, because it's 3D, and covered by our perception would say it's 4D, and you would perceive all angles at the same time, warping both perception and time itself. This is my very bad explanation of what SpongeBob should look like. The question is, though, why doesn't he? Well, because like I said, we're just seeing his shadow, and his shadow, because he's 4D, would appear 3D, and in return would look like a normal sponge, just able to do insane things we can barely perceive. This also explains how he survives everything, since because his shadow can't be harmed, he in reality is invincible. This also explains his speed, since like I said, the fourth dimension is both geometry and time, and in Einstein's theory, those two things relate heavily, and while a lot of it is out of the scope of this video, the simple point made is that SpongeBob is outside of our framework. Moving at light speed is not difficult for him, since he is not on the same plane as the light, and this in some way is all scientifically possible. The fourth dimension is a thing mathematicians and physicists know about and are beginning to apply to our understanding of reality, and I guess in SpongeBob Squarepants, he's very much applying it. But that doesn't solve one thing. Why is he from the fourth dimension? In the lore itself, how does it make sense? Is there even proof of this even, other than it just lining up very well? Thankfully, we do, and it all lies in a few episodes of the show, a comic that nobody knows about, and the most insane work of fiction ever, and an episode not even about SpongeBob. Let me explain. There is a famous theory, being string theory, the current best attempt physicists have at a unified theory of everything, and they predict not 3 or 4 dimensions of space or time, but 11, 10 spatial dimensions and 1 of time. Now, I have proposed that SpongeBob is from the 4th, and now with some more context in the show, I'll prove it in universe and some other horrifying things along the way. The SpongeBob universe canonically contains 9 named dimensions. That's right, 9. These were dimensions that were named by SpongeBob and Patrick, meaning SpongeBob knows about them. They also work on a hierarchy structure, just like string theory. This is getting eerily uncomfortable. But here's the thing, it doesn't stop at that, no. SpongeBob Squarepants as a show, franchise, and character has been to these other dimensions, even the 9th in the comic book special, where he unlocks the secrets of the multiverse and a bunch of other insane stuff. Yeah, the comics are pretty crazy. We are actually told in the comics themselves that SpongeBob can not only perceive, but travel through these dimensions, including the ninth. And if you remember before, that wouldn't be possible unless SpongeBob works on a higher plane beforehand. But does that solve our craziest feat, him pulling apart the entire universe with a string? Well, yeah. He is literally pulling on the same strings that string theory proposes are the fabric of reality, for he exists on the same plane as them. It all makes sense. But that isn't it. No, because in my research, I realized we've seen the fourth dimension, our yellow demon's home, in the show, and he wasn't even there. Season 1, Episode 14, SB 129. In his, Squidward accidentally freezes himself, being frozen all the way to the future, and goes on a series of wacky adventures through time, seeing many versions of SpongeBob, except in one place he calls nowhere. This place unsurprisingly follows none of our laws of physics. Time is warped, cause and effect don't exist, and nothing makes sense, unless our perception of normal doesn't apply to this place. Because yes, in a 3D world, actions are predictable outcomes. You walk left, you move left. But in a 4D plane, directions don't need to follow our perception of them, especially if you don't even know what direction you're moving. Plus, time is obviously not going to work on the same way it works here, since nowhere, if it is the fourth dimension, is also the plane of time, one where it's warped to its world, shaping its speed and timeline based on nothing we can imagine. But really, the biggest evidence that nowhere is the fourth dimension is that it's the only place that Squidward goes to without SpongeBob. See, in our theory, for some reason, maybe out of boredom, SpongeBob, a fourth dimensional being, left his home for ours, meaning in his world he would not be there. So SpongeBob not being in nowhere, in my mind, proves it is the fourth dimension. But if it's not for you, how about this for evidence? The only way Squidward could not leave this place that was basically torturing him in a way he would find worse than SpongeBob is betting to see SpongeBob, saying he misses him, is dying to see him, would do anything for him. This proves nowhere itself is governed by one thing, SpongeBob. For he is the fourth dimension, for he is a god in every way we can imagine, not a simple sponge. No, he is something above, and his shadow has loomed over the show for decades, and will for decades more. If you liked this video, watch this video on screen and comment a cartoon question you want answered with science. Bye!